The Texas A&M Aggies host the LSU Tigers in a primetime matchup at Kyle Field. Upstart A&M in year one of Mike Elko looking to take claim of first place in the SEC. Helping us break it all down from the Texas A&M perspective, Robert Behrens, the managing editor of Good Bull Hunting, a fantastic Texas A&M entity, joins the show. Robert, appreciate you taking the time, my friend. It is a pleasure to have you on, and excited to talk Aggies and break down this game on Saturday specifically with you.
Yeah, man, it's a big one coming up. Biggest one we've had in a long time. So happy to have on and talk about it.
So, Robert, before we dive in the game on Saturday night, I want to get your thoughts. Obviously, year one of the Mike Elko era, got off to a rough start. There was a lot of hype, obviously, around that Notre Dame game at Kyle Field. You fall in that one 20-13, but since rattled off 6 straight victories, including the big one over Missouri that I think, Robert, that was really the game that caught the attention of the national viewing audience, if you will, just the way that one went down. Conner Weigman obviously was reinserted back in the lineup. He had an incredible game, a 41-10 victory over then a top 10 Missouri team. Just your overall thoughts, Robert, on maybe where Texas A&M is at compared to what your expectations were for the Aggies at this point in year one of Mike Elko.
Well, I think what we're seeing playing out is maybe not what everyone expected necessarily, but what a lot of A&M fans hoped we might see in year one of Mike Elko. Because while this team certainly had its fair share of issues under Jimbo Fisher, the one thing that we knew this team had was talent. This was not a perfect roster, but it was a roster that had a lot of good pieces that were still here. And so the optimistic view coming in was, well, if you can take that talent and you put it in a scheme and put it in an overall program that's more efficient, that's kind of taking more advantage of what those guys can do, that this team could be pretty good. This team could win some games. And certainly that wasn't a finished product right out of the gate. And when we saw that against Notre Dame, especially struggling offensively, but yeah, it's hard to argue with the results ever since then, going with 6 straight wins. And while it hasn't been a ride that's without bumps, we've seen this team struggle in individual games or struggle, on certain units. But for the most part, you feel like that arrow continues to point up, and you continue to kind of see more and more reasons for optimism with A&M, whether it's, I think the defense, we came in certainly thinking that would be a strength, and has only gotten better over the course of the year. And I feel like the offense too is kind of started to figure itself out. And a big part of that is getting Conner Weigman healthy, and getting the most out of him. But yeah, from the A&M perspective, still some big games to play, still a lot of season left, but sitting here at 6-1, undefeated in the SEC as an A&M fan, as an A&M graduate for myself, it's hard to not be pretty darn excited.
Robert, what do you feel like has been the most positive change that Mike Elko has brought, again, in his short time? And obviously has gone through an entire offseason as the Aggies head coach and, through 7 games. And we knew, Robert, when he was hired, he was essentially the antithesis of Jimbo Fisher. I think what most agreed what this program needed, less of the flash and more of kind of a lunch pail, mentality, if you will, blue-collar mentality. Obviously was an Aggie before and understood, the standard and the expectation. But what do you feel like has been the biggest change, that's been the biggest positive thus far in the Mike Elko era?
I think the drumbeat you continue to hear the most is just about the program, I think, holding players a lot more accountable for their actions, as far as player guys being on time, guys, all the position groups are supposed to eat together. And it's a lot of not complicated, not super revolutionary things, but it's just about, I think, setting those expectations and also keeping the players accountable to all those expectations. And I think that's something that, whether it was Jimbo, whether it was the support staff or whoever, you just didn't have all those details in place to run, what has become, very complex, very large programs in college football. And Jimbo, Jimbo, I think he loved his X's and O's. Jimbo loves football. I'm not sure that he was built to run a modern college football program with all of those moving parts, with the massive staffs. I think it was just a little bit too much, and I think that's why we saw a lot of the cracks in the program in recent years. So bringing in a fresh voice, bringing in a fresh perspective, I think has done a lot of wonders for just the program culturally. And then I think also just some really nailing some of those assistant hires. I know the biggest one that we talk about is Adam Cushing at offensive line, because that group was maybe the worst position unit on the team the past couple of years. And they bring in one transfer, but other than that, it's really the same guys that we saw before. But that group they looked solid to begin the year and have only gotten better over the course of the season. So, and we all said coming in, hey, if the O-line can be decent, I think this could be a good team. And that's proven itself to be true. So I think it's just the combination of the two. It's the program building and the culture, but also just I think having a new staff that maybe is doing some things right where the previous group was falling short.
I want to go to the decision Mike Elko made reinserting Conner Weigman into the lineup in that game against Missouri, a decision that, I could have backfired, right? Marcel Reed obviously won a few games as the starter. Just talk about that and how it's impacted A&M season, because I obviously think that for Texas A&M to reach the ceiling on this season and what this team can achieve, Conner Weigman needed to be the guy. I think Marcel Reed fit really well in a Colin Klein system, but just speak on that decision. I mean, I think that's one that, if Texas A&M, let's just hypothetically say double-digit win season, let's say they make it to Atlanta, I think we're going to look back on that moment in Texas A&M's 2024 season as kind of the defining moment where Mike Elko sort of went against the grain, went with his better judgment, what he had seen at practice, what he knew about his football team, made a tough decision, and it paid off major dividends.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head that he could have easily stuck with Marcel Reed, just because Reed came in, was 3-0, and did not turn the ball over a single time. And while the offense definitely had some limitations under Reed, especially in the passing game, I think the path of least resistance would have been, oh, well, let's just ride with him and see what happens. And not many people would have faulted him for that. But I think that the biggest thing that you hit on was there's so much that we don't see, be that in practice or in meetings, whatever else. There's a lot more that goes into these roster decisions beyond just what we see on the field. And especially, so many folks try to make wins and losses a quarterback stat. And I just don't think that that's very fair. And so I really the whole time felt like once Weigman was healthy that he deserved another shot, because so many people saw that Notre Dame game and look, that was his worst performance as a college quarterback. So left a lot of people with a bad taste in their mouth. But we had seen so much from him before that to say, okay, like we can't just write this guy off because of one game. So I said it was the right call. I'm certainly glad that it seems like myself as well as Mike Elko seem to be getting proven right on that. Because Weigman is not, he's not just like elite, no questions asked. He is a little bit of hot and cold. We saw last week against Mississippi State where the accuracy was there, but he made some really questionable decisions with where he threw the football, to the point that he had 2 picks. He could have had a couple more. And that's certainly something that you cannot afford to do this Saturday. So I do think which version of Conner Weigman you get will go a long way in deciding how this game and how the rest of the season goes. But absolutely, the ceiling that he gives you is what makes you excited about this team, because when he is playing at his highest potential, I think it makes A&M a pretty darn hard team to beat.
Robert, you alluded to this earlier, but I'll ask you, biggest Texas A&M home game since when?
So I've seen people throw out so many other games. And certainly, A&M's had their share of big games and big games at Kyle Field in recent years. But here's the thing. A&M, since they've been in the SEC, has never entered the month of November controlling their own destiny in the conference standings. I mean, that alone tells you, I think, the shortfalls of this program in recent years. And I will tell you this. I think the last time A&M had a game with this much on the line was in 1998, sadly. And that was in November. A&M, I think, was ranked 8th or 16th, somewhere around there. But we were hosting Missouri, who was number 13. And, of course, that was back Big 12 days. But that was the last time that A&M was still sitting there, in the lead in the conference, being able to say, okay, if we take this other team out, then we have the inside track. And not coincidentally, 98 was the last time that A&M won a conference title. So certainly there's a lot of other big games you can point to that A&M has been a part of. Some of them they've won, a lot of them too they've lost. But I really do struggle to think of another time where this late in the season, you could look at a game and say, if you win this one, you're in the driver's seat. And that's what A&M has on the table on Saturday.
Robert, I want to talk about this, and I use the word rivalry, and I use that word. There's maybe some on the LSU side that they don't want to call it a rivalry. A&M fans maybe do call it a rivalry. All I know is this, Robert, from what I see on social media, these two sides hate each other. Can you kind of shed some light on, because this has been a pretty wacky series. I mean, we've seen some crazy final results, the 7 overtime game, a 5-7 A&M team beats a SEC West champion LSU team 2 years ago. Obviously LSU is 0-3 in their last 3 trips to Kyle Field. But this overall series, is it fair to call this a rivalry? And I mean, even if you don't, can you speak to the bad blood in this series? Because it seems like there's a lot more to it than just, hey, the two sides don't like each other. This one feels really personal for both these programs. Yeah,
and I think, fans ascribe certain things when you throw out the word rivalry, because certainly for A&M's biggest rival is Texas, and no one's going to argue with you on that. And LSU fans, no one's going to say on their side that A&M is their biggest rival either. But I think you hit the nail on the head that these two teams have had some pretty darn close games in recent years. And really, I think when A&M first came into the SEC, I do think it felt a bit forced, and there really wasn't as much of that animosity there because A&M had just come in the conference. We hadn't played each other in, almost 20 years. And then LSU won the first 6 games. And so it's hard to generate a lot of hate when it's that one-sided. But then you look at the past 6 years, and it's been just the home team has won every single game. And as you pointed out, some of those have been really weird games. Chief among them, that 7 overtime, just psychotic game back in 2018. And then I know, LSU fans will point to things from that game that they say they should have won. We'll look at 2021 in Death Valley where we stripped their guy in a punt return with 2 minutes left in the game where we could have just, knelt the ball out, but then they call it a bogus forward progress. I mean, there's definitely enough ammunition on both sides now where I would say it's a rivalry because, I mean, how do you define that other than it's teams who, play each other often, who usually geographically have some proximity and generally have a lot of folks that don't like each other. And I think it checks all those boxes because, A&M being really kind of, the closest Texas school as far as the big boys anyway to LSU. And look, both of them hit that Houston area really hard in recruiting. Both of them hit up Louisiana really hard in recruiting. I know, A&M's pulled some major players out of there. Le'Veon Moss, our running back, chief among them at the moment. So yeah, there's absolutely some bad blood there. It's not like anyone is going to talk about this amongst the greatest rivalries in college football. But when you get a game that has been pretty darn interesting in recent years and then add the kind of stakes that we have on Saturday, I definitely think you can say that this is a rivalry game.
So, Robert, when you take a look at LSU and the matchup that it presents, A&M and the Tigers doing battle again, primetime matchup at Kyle Field, when you look at LSU specifically, what do you see from them? Maybe some matchups where you feel like A&M has the advantage and can exploit them, and are there some areas that you look at LSU and you have some concern for the Aggies in regards to the overall matchup on Saturday night?
I think the most interesting aspect is going to be that A&M defensive line against LSU offensive line. I know you're seeing the stats thrown out there. LSU's, I think they've allowed about 2 sacks all year, something like that. And that A&M defensive line will get after you, especially at defensive end with Nick Scorton and Shamar Stewart. So I think that's going to be a really interesting battle, both schematically and also just with those guys going at each other all night long, and whichever one gets the best of it, I think is going to have a pretty darn good chance to win. But as far as units going against each other, I do think the worry for A&M is still in the secondary, especially in, I think, downfield passing game. A&M has given up some explosive plays this year. That's kind of been their weakness, is that they really exceed, or they really excel at tackles for loss. They overall tackle pretty well, but you'll see a blown coverage, or you'll see a guy get behind a defense, and that's the kind of stuff that can kill you, especially against a team that likes to throw it around as much as LSU does. So so if Nussmeier can have time in the pocket, and if he can find those guys downfield, that could be how they win the game. I do think on the A&M side, as far as offense goes, I think A&M will look to be a little bit more balanced with the run and the pass. Certainly with Weigman in the game, they do pass a fair amount, but especially in this Colin Klein offense with Le'Veon Moss back there and Amari Daniels in the backfield, A&M, when they can, like when the run game is working, they are not afraid to lean on it. And run defense may be the perceived weakness of that LSU defense as well. And so I wouldn't be surprised if A&M really does try to key in on that, especially in the second half as the game wears on. A lot of times that's where you really see where the offensive line can kind of wear out a defense and really just seize control of the game if they can have success on the ground. And I wouldn't be surprised if that's what you see out of A&M.
So, Robert, looking at this game, key or keys to the game for Texas A&M if they're going to take down LSU and move to first place solo in the SEC?
I think the biggest one is you have to get the same Conner Weigman that we got against Missouri. And we know it's there because we've seen it in that game. We've seen it in previous games. But it hasn't been that way every game. And so this is a big one where he's got to step up, and you hate to boil it down to quarterback play, but for me, I really do feel like A&M is evenly matched in so many other places, and perhaps even has advantages in other places, to the point that if Weigman plays to that same standard that we saw 3 weeks ago, I think A&M wins the game. And on the flip side, I would say for LSU, it's protecting Nussmeier and maybe on his same thing, Nussmeier kind of avoiding the catastrophic mistake, because that's really been his Achilles heel as well, is that he makes some incredible throws, but then also makes some really ill-advised throws, and so it sounds cliche to say, oh well, the quarterback that plays better is probably going to be the one that wins the game, but I do think in a game like this, where I really do think both teams do a lot of things really well. I think both teams seem to be trending in the right direction this season. I really do think that's probably what it's going to be coming down to.
Robert, before we get you out of here, your thoughts on the blackout at Kyle Field? I've seen a lot of chatter about that on social media, people debating on what color to wear, whatnot. Mike Elko has really embraced the tradition of A&M, but also I think, playing into what the players like. I know Jimbo was very we just got to wear the same thing. Thoughts on the blackout at Kyle Field? It probably doesn't have a factor in the game, but I mean, hey, listen, 2024 college football, you never know, it could.
Yeah. I mean, I'm with you that ultimately once the ball kicks off, none of this is going to matter. But certainly as a fan, I mean, I love it. You see all the helmets behind me. Obviously, I'm kind of a uniform nerd. So, and we haven't even seen the full uniform A&M's wearing. We saw back in August they released the jersey, but we haven't seen the full like helmet, the uniform, everything else. But the rumor is that it's going to be an all black uniform, and then LSU announced today they're going to wear all white. So that'll be a really fun look. And then I know that like you said, there's been some debate online of some Aggies saying, "Oh well, our colors are maroon and white, so that's what I'm going to wear." And look, and I get it. Like, A&M is very much about tradition, but when the players and the coaches tell you this is what we want to do, I mean, if you're not there to support them the best way that they're asking you to, I don't know why else we're going to the games. So certainly, I would hope that everybody's there wearing black. It's one game. It's it's not going to kill you to wear something that's not maroon for one Saturday. But I mean, but the atmosphere in general, regardless of what the team is wearing, what color the fans are wearing, it's going to be 100,000 plus. That's at night. I know people talk about Saturday night in Death Valley, but Saturday night in Kyle Field is going to be pretty darn special too.
Robert Behrens of Good Bull Hunting, the SB Nation affiliate for the Texas A&M Aggies, and again, one of the best in the business when it comes to covering A&M. Robert, I appreciate you taking the time. Let folks know, in case they've been living under a rock, where they can check out all your work.
Sure. You can check out my writing and other Photoshop hijinks and everything else over at goodbullhunting.com. And you can also find me on X at RCB05.
Robert, appreciate you taking the time, my friend. Best of luck this weekend at the Aggies, and let's definitely do it again soon.
Absolutely, man. Appreciate it.